Welcome everyone to the APAC FinTech Payments Forum, the 5th edition. I'm Camilla Bullock and I have the pleasure of running the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And for those of you who haven't come across us, we are the leading branch organization for the payments industry in APAC. So we bring together all players from big banks, global banks, small banks, the rails, the payment service providers, the platforms, the supporters, the innovators, the builders. We often called like the broad home of payments providers because we have a big flavor in our membership. So one of the things that we've set out is really to represent our region on a global arena also. And hence this once a year APAC FinTech Payments Forum is a really important event in our calendar. And we're bringing this forum together with 19 FinTech associations across the region. So thank you to all the FinTech associations for supporting us in this venture. And thank you to all who's dialing in today, because it's so important for us that we get to hear your voice so we can represent you. And specifically when I'm saying represent, that the vision of EPA is to enhance payments and improve lives everywhere through payments. And a big focus we had for a long time is around cross-border payments, and we were early involved in the G20 project. We have a seat on each of the task forces, the LRS, the Legal, Regulatory and Supervisory, the PI, which is all around the infrastructure, and then also the API expert panel, and that it was bringing us here today. And I'm going to let the panel tell you much more about this project, and we're also going to hear from Nigel Lee, who's on our advisory board. Hopefully this microphone is working. Nigel, I'll come to you in a little bit. And also Monica Yasuya, who's in my team, joined recently. She's based in India, a very well-known payments influencer with more than, I think about 25 years, yes, specifically around product and payments. I'm going to ask you, Nigel, that there's been a lot of work done in the G20 project, and specifically exciting is actually this report we're going to talk about today, because it's very hands-on, more than the other things that's come down for the G20 project, I think. What do you see like as the opportunities, and also who is it for, and what might be the challenges to implement it? And then maybe you can just tie in Monica a little bit in that discussion. So I hand over to you and Monica.
Great. No, thank you very much, Camilla, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be able to join. I mean, very pleased to be involved in some of the roundtables that we've had, that EPAA has held on this subject. It is such an important subject. I mean, I think the whole issue around cross-border payments is one that is driving economies. If you look at some of the stats, they're huge numbers. You can pick a number, but the reality is that anywhere between $50 and $60 trillion in B2B cross-border payments happen today, and that's likely to grow by something like 50% over the next 4 or 5 years. That's an enormous figure. And I mean, interestingly, the more people that can be involved in the cross-border payments play, the faster that will grow. And that's very good for economies. It's very good for particularly small, medium enterprise. And e-commerce is the main driver of that, of course. But in that e-commerce play, the way I see it from the discussions that I've been involved with, there are clearly several different players. There are consumers, there are businesses themselves, and there's government. And today, cross-border payment tends to be driven by the systems that have existed for a very, very long time indeed. They're the standardized systems running through banks, running through schemas, and I guess if you want to the final place of where most cross-border payments tends to get consummated today, it's via the SWIFT interface. To me, cross-border, all payments require trust, and the current cross-border payment infrastructure, it has trust in it, but the problems that it has are that it's inflexible, it can be quite expensive, it's often very slow. And to on-ramp onto it, there are gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers tend to be the current owners of the infrastructures within regulatory environments today. If you parallel that with what's happened in the open banking infrastructure move in Europe, for example, that it was not until APIs were defined for open banking, clearly there were other standards as well, regulatory standards, trust standards, etc. But when APIs were defined to enable open banking, you suddenly had more participants being able to start, initiate transactions, being able to be part of the ecosystem, being able to consider new business models to speed up the way transactions would happen, being able to reach right to the consumer and separate the payment initiation from the payment consummation, wherever that happened, and the settlements. And that can only happen when you have standardization, when you start to have API infrastructures that define clear processes that need to create a minimal viable product of processes. Now we have today ISO 20022 as a messaging standard. And that's though a little bit like saying, okay, we're going to define that everybody needs to have an engine and it needs to be able to consume a fuel. How to build it? Well, there are a billion parts. In fact, actually, there are 4,000. I think we heard in one of the complaints in one of the meetings we had, 4,000 different fields that anyone could choose. Right? Some of them will be chosen by some participants, some by others. Without a standardization of the processes to consume those fields, those minimum set that are important, and then how those processes flow through into being able to create some of the overall processes that are required for the financial transactions, payment initiation, some of the back office transactions, some of the payment tracking transactions, reconciliation, which we've heard a lot about. Without an API approach to being able to make that relatively standard, it will become very difficult to move away from the current infrastructure that exists in cross-border. So that's not my take on it, which is why it is so important, I think, to really start to understand how we can get the technical parts of this to be defined clearly. And defined as I say, I always think about it as a minimal viable product, so that then, frankly, all participants in the industry can take over and start to speed up the process by which B2B, B2C, and other cross-border payment infrastructures can then develop. So that's kind of where I come from. And Monica, I know you have a different, we all come at different places in how we've had our experiences over time. I'm curious, for you, as we shape up this discussion, what do you see? Are there additions to that? Are there things that you would concur with?
So, Najid, I completely concur with what you just said. I personally feel that cross-border payments, I mean, we talk a lot about the disruption specifically from the fintech point of view. However, I share a very slightly different take on this. I think the fintechs are going to stay and will want to continue to disrupt a space which is ripe for disruption simply because it hasn't been changed in a very long time. And this is something that we all allude to. There are payment systems that are not talking to each other, which is why the need for talking the same language has been recognized by and is being worked on by the working groups, which we'll be hearing later about. Personally speaking, though, what I'm seeing develop across the world, specifically from the emerging markets, is a need to actually have systems that not only talk to each other, but countries want to have sovereignty into how they think about cross-border payments and the ability to be able to choose which infrastructure they want to tap into. Also, there is a lot of talk about de-dollarization, and without getting into the political implications of this, there is a need and there is a growing demand by governments to adopt a currency which is suitable for them, specifically post the war situation that we have all seen. And these efforts need to be realized by technology and platforms which enable this to happen at scale. Apart from the G20 targets of increasing access, reducing cost, transparency, and increasing efficiency in the system, now with cross-border payments relying essentially on faster payment systems being connected to each other, there is more conversation on fraud and data sharing, which means that as fraud goes up, we need to share more data. Now, when you tie all these elements together, it really becomes, it is all based on the foundation of technical speak and being able to exchange messages which everybody else understands. Therefore, speaking the same language is very critical. And that is why when we are talking about API harmonization, it becomes a topic not just for technical advancements of infrastructure, but also to actually further business implications across the world. And I think from the value of being able to create and further business value, I think this is a very important conversation to have had, specifically for our emerging countries. And I think Asia is leading the way in all conversations around cross-border payments.
And Monica, I think that's as you say, an additional take on some of the constraints, some of the drivers, and some of the constraints around trying to take the initial work around API standardization and then think about what gets implemented and how it gets implemented, which I know May and the team are going to talk about at length. One thing that does strike me though, and I'd be interested in your view on this as we just to seed the discussion and the thinking process of people. Each of the current players have, I would argue, an interest in this not happening. If you think about the way in which the current banking infrastructure operates, they are the architects, the arbiters of cross-border. When you think about the fintechs who do cross-border today, often their endpoints are into banking accounts, and therefore they also are, and they've spent a lot of money building those endpoints and infrastructure. And Swift, with its all of its talk about wanting to change, obviously change is expensive, and being the incumbent sometimes has an advantage. So do you have a view that for everyone on the call here to think about as we talk about this, as to how and why those players should be incented to want to do something in this space?
Nigel, that's such a great question. And to be honest, when we think about the fintech side of things, the one question that comes up is what is in it for them to do when banks, financial institutions, and even governments are playing such an active role. I think this is where the mind shift and I think a lot of VC and other interest will start lying, which is that the infrastructure play will be really set, and it's currently being set by infrastructure providers all across the world, fintechs and others who currently have endpoints into being able to build out these rails will have to tap on to new opportunities. Now, the fact of the matter is, even with EPA, our vision is to be able to help payments be accessible to everyone. The opportunity is so big, and we've really not tapped into the big opportunity that lies ahead. And with trade opening up between most countries, minus of China, of course, there is a very big opportunity for small sellers and SMEs to actually gain from this revolution that is taking place to make cross-border payments accessible for all. We normally talk about the consumer side of the story, but in EPA as well, we've been looking at the SME side of the revolution that is currently happening. And with cross-border trade being such an essential element that is now being created for many of the emerging economies, specifically in Asia, to rely on being able to sell both services as well as product cross-border. It's important that we now focus on that opportunity size, which continues to go up. And we cannot behave in that kind of territorial way that we used to, which is whatever is ours tends to be our proprietary only, and nobody else can participate in it. I think those boundaries are broken very simply by governments going ahead and creating their own bilaterals, which is a very expensive way of managing things, of course, as we have seen. And we have been hearing from Project Nexus and all that BIS is doing. But these things will continue to happen. But I still believe that the opportunity to also serve the underserved population is so high in our markets that I think we are just scratching the surface of the opportunity. In fact, most fintechs we're speaking to right now are actually most excited by these projects because it gives them a tap into an existing infrastructure. Don't need to build out. And then most of the differentiation will happen based on service, performance, and of course, efficiency. So I think that's a great place to be in from where we are today.
No, perfect. I'm going to hand back to Camilla here. I think we should, and that's hopefully hopefully useful intro for everybody.
So with that, I'm going to welcome May from AP Plus, CIO AP Plus in Australia. She's also the chair of the EPA Advisory Board. Stephen Lindsay from Swift and Nilesh Dosan from AWS. I'll hand over to you, May.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, Nigel and Monica. It's a really great segue and the introduction of the why from your point of view. So as mentioned by Camilla, that today's great. So we got three authors here as well. So Stephen and Nash and myself are three of the panel, the APEX, we call ourselves API panel of expert that co-author this paper. So for the next 15 minutes, we'd like to share with you what it is and how did we come about, and what are our point of view that can help as a first step to operationalize it. Because it is a paper, it is a report. Without the action, it's just a paper. So yeah, so without further ado, I'll probably come to you first, Stephen. Would be great to share with us that what is this report about? How can we frame it for the audiences here?
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. So the report has been quite a while in gestation, but it stems from work that was originally done in the CPMI report into cross-border payments from, I think, a couple of years ago now, where they identified a number of building blocks. And they first of all, recognized that there were, delays and other inefficiencies in the cross-border payment space, and they identified a series of different building blocks to start to address some of those. One of those was ISO 20022 standardization. There's been a lot of effort put into that, as was mentioned earlier. And another of those was to say that we're increasingly seeing APIs take a role in the end-to-end payments value chain. But as has already been said by Nigel and others, that's going to be limited in its impact in what is really a network business unless there's some standardization, right? I mean, it's okay perhaps between a few counterparts that they can define an API amongst themselves and start to use that and to develop it. But if you're talking cross-border, which means many markets inherently, then you're going to need some standardization for these things to be able to talk to each other. So that was identified fairly early on as a building block. And the APEX group that was put together by CPMI under the chairmanship of the Bank of England was really there to start to bring some meat to the bones, if you like, of that basic statement that we need to harmonize, we need to standardize the APIs that we use for cross-border if we're going to start to really extract the benefit from them, in this kind of business. So that was sort of the starting point. And I think as we all started to talk to one another, and we had some great meetings in Basel and elsewhere, as we started to put the paper together, we started to sort of bring the focus of the report on to really four basic principles. One is that we have to facilitate harmonization. That this harmonization is not something that's going to happen on its own. That you need the governance structures and you need the mechanisms by which harmonization can happen. It's not going to happen, sort of organically or just emerge, right? It needs to be something that's managed. I think the second one is that we need to agree on some basic design principles and principles for reuse and principles in general for what makes a good API and what makes it easy to discover and easy to plug into an existing value chain. On that point, also to enhance the developer experience, to make sure that developers have a straightforward way of, first of all, finding APIs and working with them and so on. So a lot of effort in the report was put into basically trying to define what good looks like from the perspective of a developer. And then finally, it was looking at some of the things that we might, some of the areas that we might deploy APIs, recognizing that cross-border payments, as I say, is sort of inherently a network business with many parties potentially taking part in the value chain. What are the opportunities, the sort of the quick wins for API technology to improve on where we are today? And I think one of those, and I'm sure this is going to come up a few times in our conversations, is on pre-validation. The notion really that you can make sure that the data that's going into the payments transaction, going into the pipe at the beginning, is correct, it's clean, it's ready to be processed in a straight-through processing manner, so with full automation. So a lot of effort on, again, in terms of what we were defining as the not only the principles, but also the sort of the key recommendations and areas for action on the report. We're looking at that. How can we improve today's end-to-end payment processes through the application of standardized APIs, and the notion of having pre-validation to improve the quality of data going into the system before it gets processed was one that sprang out immediately, and a number of the participants on the group brought that up.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a great way to summarize what are the categories of the report. So I would like to come to you, Ninesh. Knowing that in this paper, we talk about the stakeholders. So the audiences is it's quite diverse. It includes the relevance of the PSP, the payment system infrastructure like us, AP+, the different authorities, the standard bodies, the associations like FinTech association here, the actual tech providers or the fintech themselves, and developers and the end users. So coming from what you've seen at AWS, especially you led the the institutional payments and the strategy for those institutional banking and client perspective. I would like to come to you to unpack a little bit further on the first category in terms of the driving the global harmonization processes. Where do you see the first opportunity that as an industry we can come together?
Sure, absolutely. So,
and also one more thing, I remember you were very passionate about talking about the reference architecture. So please do feel free to share that insight too.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my views. Just to take a step back and add on to what Stephen was saying. In addition to the four categories that in terms of recommendations that the group came up with, there were two, call it overarching thought processes going on throughout the discussions we've had over the last year and change. So one is, like May said, there are various stakeholders involved in the cross-border payments landscape in general. In the post-COVID world, the cross-border payments have not only increased for retail transactions, but also for corporate payments or even small to medium-sized businesses, where, depending on the flow of funds, trade, et cetera, cross-border payments are increasing year over year. More importantly, the nature of cross-border payments are also changing, right? Cross-border payments are no longer just high-value payments that they used to be between, two big companies. Now there are companies like Amazon and other companies who do thousands and thousands of low-value payments cross-border every day. So what we tried to do is come up with these recommendations in two basic ways. One is try to keep them as neutral as possible. And what we mean by that is we wanted to make them as ubiquitous as possible in terms of the different processes, payment, messaging standards, developer experience, things like that. So try to keep them as neutral as possible. And the second thing is, even though this was done in the context of the G20 targets, we wanted to ensure that this can be applicable to any country, any market infrastructure, any corporate, any business, any Paytm or others, mobile wallets who want to get into the cross-border payments business. So we wanted to make it as broad as possible, because cross-border payments, as we all know, right, are no longer just between two bank accounts. They can happen between mobile wallets, they can happen cash locations, all kinds of things. So we tried to do that. Now, coming back to what May is talking about, right, in terms of opportunities. What we've seen at AWS generally, opportunities are, there are two catalysts that act as change agents for anything that happens from a payment standpoint. One is customer demand, right? So like I said, the expectations around their experience when it comes to cross-border payments is changing. Everyone, including people like you or I, or businesses, corporates, they all want cross-border payments to be faster, cheaper, and as ubiquitous as possible. So customer experience drives a lot of changes that are happening in the industry. The second catalyst that can happen comes from policy objectives, right? Like the central banks might have, or the G20 might come up with some policy objectives and say, hey, we want to reduce the friction in cross-border payments by X% by certain timeframes. So using those as, call it, the starting points, then it comes down to, okay, how can we use those things as the, call it, the North Star, and figure out what do we need, how can we work backwards from that to meet some of those objectives. And it generally starts with a use case, right? So what we try to do at AWS is we start with a customer use case, whether that's on retail remittance payment or corporate payments or whatever the case might be our customers are looking for, and then work backwards from that. And the opportunities that personally I see in the area of cross-border payments is the last mile, right? There is tremendous friction, like Steven said, in the last mile delivery of these cross-border payments. And if we can solve some of these friction points from a last mile delivery standpoint by one, coming up with a standard set of APIs that can enable institutions or different stakeholders to talk to each other, that would be one start point. But also the second thing that could be done is there are several countries where they've implemented or they're implementing what the industry calls as confirmation of pay, which leads into the pre-validation that Stephen talked about. So if the industry in general adopts a practice of pre-validating payment instructions before the payment is actually sent, if the developers, when they're building different applications, try to include that as a part of their process, then that organically will reduce the friction from when it comes to last mile delivery of the transactions. Now, as we all know, payments is a regulated industry. We have to factor in risk, regulation, compliance, all those things into this. And to the extent we can include that in the context of the confirmation of payee and last mile delivery, I think that could be a starting point to reduce the friction. Now, when it comes to reference architectures, I'm a big proponent of that. And what we mean by that is if you come up with standards, right? Standards are basically, or specifications. They are basically recommendations, technical documentation, but there is nothing which developers can actually touch and use and play around with those specs in terms of different use cases. So what we try to do is we try to create at AWS reference architectures, whether it's using things on the cloud or on-prem or anything. So say if it's a API spec to do confirmation of pay, we'll try to help the developers come up with a starting point and say, hey, here's a template that we've created. Use this in a test environment to test out different scenarios, and then make it your own. To customize it according to your use case. Now, the key point over here is to make it open and not have your IP or licensing restrictions on top of that. So if you create that as a starting point, then the developers can take that as a starting point, make it their own, and then kind of go live with different use cases that they're working on. So as industry participants, that's what we can do. One is we can communicate effectively the importance of following these recommendations. That's number one. Number two is we can give tools as starting points for the ecosystem to start using, and then have them take that to the next level in terms of actually building production quality live applications for the use cases that they're thinking about.
Thank you, Ninesh. You really touch on all the categories that Stephen mentioned. So in particular, I think I'll compound with what Monica mentioned before. As the payment getting fast, the fraud increase. So the leverage of the data is key. And like, as we know, that ISO 20022 is here to stay, like we transition into it, but that's not the only messaging. So from the standardization perspective, especially honing onto the pre-validation, as the industry, what would be the first step that we can do to to start this harmonization process, and also recognizing that there's another category of leveraging the data standards. So harmonization doesn't necessarily mean that homogeneous. So who would like to take this question first? What would be your thoughts of the very first step, so practical steps that we can start thinking about it?
I'll have a go. I think the first thing is that the COP initiatives, which are really helpful and they're growing in many markets, as has already been said. Typically, they're implemented for a domestic market. They look at the domestic market first, and that is, of course, where the majority of the volume is going to be for that particular COP implementation. But if you're going to get value in the cross-border payment space, you need to be ready to expose those things cross-border as well. And it's, first of all, is therefore important that COP systems, to a certain extent, work a little bit the same, right? So that if I'm making a payment to Australia, or I'm making a payment to the UK, or I'm making a payment to Singapore, the results that I'm getting back from COP are, to a certain extent, they're compatible. That I can understand the same thing when I'm trying to make that payment, irrespective of which market I'm going into. And I think that it's sort of then incumbent on the implementers of those things to, even though that may not be their first priority, to think international, to think cross-border, to not preclude the use of that system cross-border in some of the design decisions that are taken, whether that be around data privacy laws or whatever else, right? So I think that these things are happening in many markets, and that's super encouraging. But if they're going to be joined up, which is what's going to be the necessary first step for using those in a cross-border context, then the operators need to talk to each other basically, and need to make sure that they think about that cross-border use case, and that there's a certain level of compatibility between different implementations.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. What about you, Ninesh? You mentioned about the reference architecture and the developer experience. How can it help to actually mobilize the first step? Well, and who role to play? Like, who's actually should be the one that orchestrating that?
Yeah, so there are two ways to think about it. So number one is policymakers or institutions who are promoting certain ways of doing cross-border payments. And I'm talking about processes, not necessarily the technical implementation. They can play a big role in terms of creating the reference architecture. There are so in the US, for example, there are organizations like NACHA and FDX and others who are working on these types of things, not in the context of cross-border payments, but data sharing in general. So neutral organizations can play a role to create reference architectures and make it available in an open system. I'll give you an example. Why is internet ubiquitous, right? Internet started 20 years ago, or even 25 years ago. It started with basic things like HTTP protocol, not to get too technical over here. But HTTP protocol was a bunch of just standards written on a piece of paper. But then what the W3C did was they created a bunch of tools that developers in those days, universities like Stanford and Berkeley and others could use to simply exchange information between Stanford and Berkeley as two institutions, right? So if you just take the same logic and expand that to here. So let's just say in the context of payments, we talk about ISO 20022. As you said, it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere, right? So if we can come up with an infrastructure and an architecture around it, which says, okay, if you want to send a payment from point A to point B, cross-border payment, there are 5 discrete, I'm making up a number, functional steps that need to take place. And here are the, say, 7 different APIs that a developer needs to call. And here are the 10 different data elements, recommended data elements that are mandatory, perhaps, depending on the regulations and the rules of the jurisdiction. And there are others, they could be optional depending on the type of payment or the value of the payment or things like that. So if you create that as a starting point, and I'm going back to the standards organizations, right? They are the ones who can do that as a starting point, and then make it available in an open format to the industry. Then they can take it from there. Very recently, Meta did this for the large language models, right? They made it open source from a generative AI standpoint, and within I think 3 months, it was downloaded over like millions of times. That's the power of open source that you can bring to the table when it comes to these types of things. And then the fintech ecosystem all over the world is very vibrant, and that is driven by the need that they are seeing from the customers. So if you make the tools available to the fintech, to the developers, they'll figure out how to use those tools to service the customers that they are trying to build these solutions for.
Thank you so much.
May I'll just hand over this piece to you to jump in the different rooms. Would that be okay? So if you want to give a little bit of reference what happened.
Yeah, okay, so I can start first. The people that are in the same room, please do jump in if I miss anything. So our topic was on the developer experience, but we did touch on other categories as well, especially on the pre-validation of payment. And I think similar to what you mentioned, that we have more questions than answer. The first is that we all believe that developer experience will help to achieve like from the harmonization perspective, but also achieve the access speed, the cost perspective. But the question is really about three fronts. One is that who are the centralized body? Should we have a centralized body to drive that through? And yes or no? And also the one is that who is funding those activities? Because to bring together, yes, we can say that we have a coalition of willing, but still that would be an investment. Let's say if we want to have a standardization of the portal, the documentation, there's certain things that need to be done. Even though if we say that crowdsource or open source, there's still a centralized body. So that's the first questions. The second one is about having achieved, let's say that we fast forward, we have achieved this harmonization. Does it actually normalize the market? In other words, that the bigger guy with that lower their margin and lower their profit, and the competitive advantage. If it is, that actually gets the industry together to move that forward at a fast pace, because that's the disadvantage for the bigger guy. And then the third one is about calling out that it needs to have the same level of playing field. So yeah, especially I think that for this cohort here is a fintech group. Like how can we ensure through this process that we still be a same level playing field for fintechs to continue to innovate and have the assets, have the benefit. Anything that miss? Team, anything want to add?
I think you covered it well, May. But even though those are mostly questions, they actually lead us to next set of questions to answer. I think there was a unanimous view that this will help, but how do we actually then drive standardization from the center, but also crowdsource the capacity and knowledge to then establish that ecosystem, and how do we actually then encourage the big and small towards a shared success. I think those are the challenges we called out, but there were some plausible ideas that made through, which is to be discussed further.
Fantastic. And we had one group that merged with Nilesh and Nigel, and Monica might potentially have been in there also. So we're expecting a lot of feedback from that group. Nigel, would you like to go first?
Yeah, let me perhaps give a summary. So just in terms of the question that we were trying to address, it was what does the industry need to bring to the regulators in order to provide them with insight and provide them, I guess, with comfort that an approach that can actually work. And Nilesh joined the group. We did have an interesting discussion. I think the first key issue that is going to be important, everyone felt was important for regulators, is identity. And it's interesting, what we discussed was that falls into a couple of categories, and we talked a little bit about, of course, national identities exist in some places and not others. But as Nilesh pointed out, the assumption around an API is you can capture a subset, at least for individuals, of a national identity type structure within each geography that ought to at least identify individuals. So you can build an API around that, and the regulators ought to be comfortable that from a technical perspective, you're capturing the data, particularly for consumer to consumer or business to person. When you talk about businesses, that's different because the business identity requirement is not necessarily going to be even close to the same in all geographies. And so there's another element that has to be considered there, which is about business ID. So those are two elements. What we all agreed was that it's not just the technical pieces of data you can capture for an API, though it is about the trust associated with the different geographies as to whether or not there is sufficient confidence that that geography is going to have a system of making sure that people's IDs and business IDs are actually valid. And that's about the processes themselves, the way the information gets into an API and who is doing it, what entities in the geographies are doing it, and who is auditing that information. So that becomes important, but the minimum with the API component is about those two elements of data. The other piece underpinning that, separate from that, but similar, that Nilesh brought up was also the identity, not just of the individual or the business, but also of the account or the form that the transaction is happening to the endpoint. And having a valid way of being able to identify the endpoint and ensure the endpoint is a valid endpoint is a separate but related identification piece that is more about transaction validation. And that's an important bit that regulators want to see so that money goes to an account that is a real account associated with a real person. And that piece, or a real business. And those are two pieces that became important. The other thing that was brought up by Craig on the call was that capital controls are probably, visibility of capital control and capital control management is probably going to be quite important for certain geographies as well. Because certain geographies have caps on cross-border flows. And having that built within an API for cross-border is probably going to be something regulators will care about. That they will want to see visibility around the nature of capital cross-border flows. And the third one I raised in a similar vein, but again, it's a question about whether or not regulators will ask for it up front, or whether it will become something that they think about during the process, which is around taxation and visibility for taxation purposes. Whether that's withholding taxes on payments related to payment types, or whether that's actually VAT type payments, depending on whether they're intra-jurisdiction or whether they're cross-border. That's probably an element the regulators will want to at least understand is being dealt with or considered, we thought. And we talked about a couple of other elements, but it was interesting because I remember we talked, Camilla, about when we were at one of the roundtables around the processes of chargeback and finalization, particularly as it relates to real-time payments. And Kun Chung from Nets talked also about questions that were previously considered by banks around FX, and particularly FX over weekends. And I think what the team thought about was that regulators might not care about those things. They're really business process considerations. They're much more about commercial requirements. And the regulators might care more about transparency around them in terms and conditions rather than API transparency or API management of them. So when we think about the things the regulators would probably care about, we need to have brought to regulators to convince them that this is important to be taken care of. It's identity on those two levels, and maybe capital controls and perhaps something related to tax.
Interesting.
I stopped there and asked the team involved in the room there, did I miss anything, or was there anything else that we thought should be on a list that we have to convince regulators of in order to be able to ensure they participate?
Thanks, Nigel. I think that covers pretty much everything. The only one other thing I would add is, depending on the type and the size of transaction, we talked about having the ability to collect additional information. So, for example, if it's a B2B payment over a certain dollar amount or a certain amount, then the regulators might want to need additional information like purpose of payment, or the type of, where the money is going, those types of things, depending on the type or the size of transaction.
Yep.
Super interesting. Thank you. It's interesting also because I can almost pair this with different entities out there and bodies that would be more interested, but we're missing some definitions. Like some of it, we're talking when it's tax, it's actually in that trade. We're talking about the identity. We have the project live, the LEI Foundation, the BIS and the Nordics is doing that program for regulations and compliance. Different projects out there. It's all about having the right room. We have one more room with Stephen.
Okay, very quickly, because I think we covered some similar ground to some of the others. The question that we were asked ourselves was, what are the benefits of harmonization and what are the pitfalls? I think that we kind of dispatched that part of the question quite quickly. I mean, obviously there's certain pitfalls in the sense that API developers like the flexibility that their technology gives them to innovate, to change, to do new things. And once you bring standards into the picture, then your ability or your agility to do that is a little bit limited, right? You can't just chop and change according to whim. On the other hand, if you consider cross-border payments as a network business, where you're going to have multiple actors involved in processing any payments, and that you might have a different route for every payment that you make, or certainly many different routes that you're having to contemplate, then if you're going to make that experience predictable and a smooth one, then the different actors in that value chain need to be acting in a way which is going to be standardized and straightforward. So I think that we kind of quite quickly landed on the notion that if particularly if you're not in a closed loop system, in an open system which you need to reach lots of different accounts, then you need a degree of standardization for the various parts of the system to interact in a predictable and straightforward way. So we kind of got to that part of the question quite quickly. But then I think we ran into and thanks very much, Nambi, for bringing it. But I think we ran into the same question as every other room, and it's kind of the elephant in the room. Really, is we have these recommendations in this report, and I think that most of them are pretty uncontroversial in terms of their what they're recommending and so on. But what we need to work on next is the how, right? If we looking at harmonization, standardization of APIs at a global level, which inherently it is, if you're in a cross-border world, what are going to be the governance structures? What are going to be the entities that make sure that coordinate and to a certain extent, perhaps also ultimately enforce the rules that govern the design and the deployment of APIs? And I think that was where I don't say we got stuck, but I think that it's obviously the next step in the conversation. We've got our recommendations now. How do we implement those? And the clear implication, if you read the report, is that there needs to be some kind of coordination and governance if we're going to achieve anything meaningful in terms of API harmonization. I think the main conclusion that we came to, that trying to get there in one go to a perfect and sort of completely ideal environment is not possible or not feasible, and that therefore we should look at look at how we can start small and build out. And starting small might mean starting in a particular geography. It might be starting with a particular use case. The one that we hit on, it was one that we talked about when we put in the report together, was COP and pre-validation. So is there something that we can do there where we can have, if you like, a sort of an MVP of governance, which will allow us to get some experience and to also build some momentum in that area. But I think that really where we landed and where probably most of the conversation took place. But I'll stop there because I'm conscious of time. Anybody from the room who would like to contribute a thought?
I might just jump in as we're out of time, so sorry, Rahul Intellidge. This has been really good. We had you for 90 minutes, everybody on the call, which we really, really appreciate, because we can't do this work in isolation, and neither can the API expert panel. So we will continue feeding what we think and what we hear from our members and what we hear from the wider community. Who and how is what I take away, and how we can narrow it down so it becomes doable. So you will hear more. Of course, we early days in this journey to enhancing cross-border payments, but I think it's very promising to see how many people are engaged and how often the different parts of the world come together to talk about this. So going back to what Nigel said in the beginning, it's so much to win if we can crack this. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers, Nilesh, Stephen, May, Nigel, Monica. I don't think I left anybody, and everybody else on the call. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon again.